Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Christ and Coffee podcast. I'm Jeremy, and this is my good friend Haig. And we are doing something new this time around. We're going to take a sort of trial run with a new thought exercise here. We're going to explore a text that we're potentially going to be preaching on in the coming weeks. And so Haig and I are going to walk through it a little bit together and see what we find interesting about the text, and sort of use this selfishly as sermon prep time. For
This
those of
is
you who don't know,
a behind the scenes look at what the life of a pastor is in the sermon
there you
prep.
go. Yeah. For those of you who don't know, this process of preparing for a message every Sunday is relentless. Every week you finish it on Sunday, and Monday you start back up again. And so Haig and I are always talking about this behind the scenes. We thought we'd post it publicly for people to interact with and maybe even comment on, and we'll see. If you like it, please do comment, and we'd love to get your feedback, and we want to be um, putting out content that people are interested in, and so we hope that this is interesting to you.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
usually when we do sermon prep, there's so much data we gather, and there is only like a 20-minute, 30-minute slot. So sometimes a pastor doesn't get to share everything they learn. So selfishly, this could be part of the information we give for the parts that we have to leave out to make the sermon relevant on Sunday. We could just nerd up on certain things. So yeah, if you
Yeah.
guys like this or not, please comment if you want us to do further episodes of behind the scenes of the sermon prep or the sermon. Also, if you have a clever title, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, yeah, help us out with those. We the more we're talking about it, the more this is like film editing. Like most of the time when you see a movie, there's like a whole bunch of content that gets cut,
Yep.
just so that it like presents well and the narrative works. And so well, hopefully if it's a good movie. And hopefully if it's a good sermon, that's what happens too. There's a lot of content that gets cut, and you get one sort of packaged message that makes sense and is one whole narrative. And so what we're doing here is giving you all the raw material that we use, and then if there's something interesting you hear here that doesn't get mentioned in the sermon, message us and we'll continue the conversation there. But we're going to start with a text that's a really famous text. It's one that was used in the early church. There's some debate over it, whether it was actually a hymn or if it was just heightened prose, but it's a text in Paul's letter to the Philippians, and it's usually titled the Christ hymn, and it's starting in chapter 2 of Philippians in verse 5. I'm going to read it for us. We're going to look at it together, and then Haig and I are just going to sort of riff back and forth about what pops in the text and maybe set it in context and explore a little bit about what's being done here in the Christ hymn. So let me pull it up and read it here for us. Philippians 2, beginning at verse 6 says, well, let's start at verse 5, actually. Let's adopt the attitude that was in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not consider equality with God something to exploit, but instead he emptied himself by taking the form of a slave and by becoming like human beings. When he found himself in the form of a human, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a Roman cross. Therefore, God highly honored him and gave him the name above all names, so that at the name of Jesus, everyone in heaven, on earth, and under the earth might bow, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. That's the Christ hymn, Philippians 2, 6-11. Haig, I know that you just did a Bible study on Philippians. So I'm wondering, in the context, what's Paul trying to do here for the Philippian church?
So normally this hymn is used as an apologetic to show an early text that predates Paul's letters to kind of prove that Jesus was proclaimed as divine from the beginning of the movement. So it wasn't like a later thing where like the monks 400 years later said, okay, we're going to deify Jesus. No, he was already that from the beginning. There was this gospel that was already secure. So that's normally the typical outlook when this sermon is preached. But the context of it is the Apostle Paul being stuck in a jail cell, probably in Rome, probably somewhere else, where he's not sure whether or not he's going to be executed. So the church in Philippi sends someone to give him provisions and goods while he's in prison. And he's giving back a thank you letter / a reminder for that church in Philippi, which is in Macedonia, to keep joy, to choose joy, to always be happy. 15 times in this 4-chapter letter, the words joy or rejoice is being used. So part of Paul's joy is singing this song or saying this poetic phrase. So he's just reminding the church, look, we have a reason to be joyful. I'm singing this song in prison, that we have salvation in Christ.
Right.
So choose joy, be joyful. Even though my circumstance is awful right now, I'm trapped in prison. I don't know if I'm going to die. Yet I'm going to still be happy. Yet I'm still going to have purpose. Yet I'm going to still focus on the good things. And I think this is so important because many of us have experienced some sort of quarantine during this year where we felt trapped. So the big idea is, even though you may be trapped, you could still choose joy.
Right. Right. The likelihood that Paul is under house arrest and not, like, when we think of prison in the States, we think of like being incarcerated in a jail cell for like whatever, a period of time or like maybe your whole life. But the Roman prison system was much different, and more likely Paul is in prison, sitting at home, being observed. Maybe he can take on some visitors, maybe he can't, we don't know. But the parallel is there, right? I mean, all of us feel like we're under house arrest right now. I mean, people are even using that language sometimes. So in that isolation, Paul finds joy. It's an irony, a very profound irony, that in a letter where Paul is least free, he's most joyful. And it's all over the pages, like you said. So joy shows up all over the text. But interestingly enough, even to magnify it more, in Greek, the word for thanks or thanksgiving is the same root as the word for joy. So kara and eukara are this. Kara is joy, eukara is thanksgiving. And so, all throughout the letter, Paul is either rejoicing or thanking God or thanking the Philippians for the gift they gave him. And so when you get here to the Christ hymn, he's doing something specific. He's centering, basically he's recalling like the contours of what Jesus did, like came to earth, died, was risen. And he does that as a sort of a reminder to the congregation of the reason he's joyful. The centerpiece of his joy comes from this one message, this what he calls the gospel. And his invitation to the church seems to be, do this, basically. I mean, this isn't just a theological speculation, like you said. It's important in some regard that this is an early account of Jesus's divinity, but it seems like even more importantly is that Paul is saying this is the rule of which we should live our faith. Like, this is the centerpiece of our ethics. Jesus did this. You also do this. And ironically, there's a joy in participating in this kind of ethic, this kind of way of life.
And I love
contagious.
Exactly. I love that joy and thankfulness are like the same root, because it's like the Eucharist is every week as a church gathers, they should be having this spirit of joy and gratefulness. But yeah, joy is contagious, because like if you're around joyful people, it's gonna like pump you up. It's gonna excite you. If you're around pessimistic people, it's just gonna like drain all your energy. There's something to it, and Paul is like keeping the joy in the midst of a circumstance where he has every right to complain. But I think thankfulness is one of the main keys for keeping joy, because it cultivates gratitude.
Right. I also wonder if we distinguish between joy and happiness. I don't know, like concretely, like what that looks like, but I think sometimes joy is more of like a posture to take, in the midst of difficult times, to like refuse despair. I think the opposite of of joy is not sadness, but despair.
Okay.
I don't know, but that's just a first take on it. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I'm not an expert, but I definitely think joy is more of something that can't be taken from you versus happiness being more of the fleeting ups and
Right.
downs, like an American Constitution. It's like the right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of this happiness, which is not necessarily attainable. It's
Right.
more of a up and down. I'm happy today. I'm not that happy. But I think if we deal with our despair, if we understand the magnitude of what the gospel really means, we should have a posture of joy never being stripped from us. Because part of this declaration is even in the worst circumstance, as Paul writes in this letter too, to live is Christ, to die is gain.
Right.
Even if I die, even if the worst thing happens to me, I'm no longer on this earth. I'm gonna have gain because
Right.
I'm gonna be part of the new creation that's gonna be coming.
Right. Right. And I think that tags in perfectly with the hymn. The hymn makes this proclamation that it's in the most God-forsaken place, at the death on a Roman cross, that God gives new creation life and brings Jesus to a place where his name is the name at which every tongue shall confess and every name bow. So I mean, and every knee bow. So it's a decision that regardless of circumstances, there is this potential, this opportunity for new creation life to be born. And quite often, sometimes, I mean, I'd even argue more often than not, it's in those places of like total devastation and like laying us bare that we find a new way forward that's going to bring joy, bring hope. Like something new comes out of it. And that's where we find ourselves discovering joy in the midst of those circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely. So to go back to the theme of this podcast, how would you preach this right now if the Sunday morning is an hour from now?
Oh yeah, I'd
What,
be
what,
I'd
what
be
would
in
be your
trouble
approach?
if Sunday was an hour, if service was an hour away and I didn't have a text yet, I'd be in trouble. But yeah, it's tough. There's so much to go with here. And again, for those of you who don't know how the process goes, you'll have some pastors who really try and take everything and like pick it apart. And I've just had a policy in my preaching to do one thing well, like to pick something within the text that really, like, I'm not going to say everything about the text. I'm going to say one or two things well about the text and hope that it connects with the congregation. So here I'd want to go probably somewhere along the theme of the character of Jesus being manifest in the character of the church. So Paul is offering the church an artistic, poetic description of Jesus's character to get them to fall in love with that character and live that character out. So it's like, you could tell somebody to be humble, but if you showed them a movie of this man of incredible humility, it's more attractive and more interesting, more likely to capture your imagination and change your actions than if you were to just tell somebody to be humble, right? Same with music, same with, when you capture someone's imagination through art, it does more in terms of changing character and changing habits and virtues. So I'd want to go in some direction like that, the character of Jesus being held up here is being offered to the church as a way of living. I'm very interested in this first line. And there's a translation issue here. So in verse 6, it says, even though he was in the form of God, he did not consider being equal with God something to exploit, or equality with God something to exploit. And there's a translation issue. Is it like, though he was in the form of God, he didn't consider being equal with God something to exploit? Or is it, he was in the form of God, so he didn't consider being equal with God something to exploit? So the interesting question is this self-giving character something that is in the nature of God, or is it something that God sets aside for a minute and decides to be self-giving? And I argue, I mean, I think that, I mean, I read the Bible and seem to think that it's in the nature of God to be self-giving. And so I find it that opening line should read something more like, because Jesus is God, this is what he did. Like, it's not, Jesus was God and he did this to show that, he was gracious and loving. No, it's because he's God that he does this act of giving of himself, even to the way of death.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'd want to go in those directions. I don't know. I don't know whether. I don't know if I was to preach a sermon. I don't know how deep I would go into that actual nuance. I might just drop the argument, like the two sides of the argument, and just land on one, and say it's in the character of God to do this, and this is, Paul is saying Jesus does this, and so this is a manifestation of his divine character.
Yeah, and that character emphasizing the humility piece, right? And the self-giving piece, because it's really hard to say I'm humble. Like, hey guys, I'm humble.
Yeah.
But like, let me show you through this poem and the gospel and the central message we have why humility is so important. Do you think there's a link between humility and joy?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that might be something to tease out in a sermon. What's the connection between humility, or maybe another way to say that, is there a connection between service and joy?
Yeah.
With giving and joy, something like that.
Which is ultimately like the ultimate virtue, which is love, right? Like charity in the Bible is like the most, it's the chief virtue is self-giving. Yeah. Which
is something like we usually think of joy as something you take or you get when you're given it. But when there is a joy in serving people, like if you have children, like I'll say, if I make a really good meal for my wife and my daughter, and I put down and I give the meal out, and my daughter scrapes her plate up and my wife says that was really great. Like, there's a joy that comes from being able to serve that way, right? And be like, here, I did that. Something I put heart into gave somebody else happiness or joy or whatever. They liked it.
Yeah, it's awesome.
And that brings joy, right? I mean, that brings a bit of joy. And so imagine on a broader level God doing that. And it's also interesting to think about God having joy. I don't know if there's anything there, but like maybe taking a more creative way into the text, like God's joy in doing what he does in Jesus Christ becomes contagious in the church, maybe. So that's maybe another way into the text. How would you preach it? I'm curious. How would you go? What would you go with?
I don't know. My preaching style is pretty much like rapid fire. So like, unlike the approach of just doing one or two things well, I'm like, all right, here's everything. Here's my 12-point sermon. I don't care if it goes over your head. I'm just gonna like unleash. And I've always been criticized, like, you should focus on 1 point or 2 points or 3 points.
Yeah.
So like, I would probably just blah, 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 like everything we're talking about.
Yeah.
But I usually anchor all my sermons in the gospel somehow. I feel like there's a big debate among pastoral circles or preaching circles whether or not you have to incorporate Jesus and the gospel into the sermon. For me, it's like, yeah, you have to. If it's not there, there's no like. It's more of like teaching time. It's like more like a Bible study. So I always like to like make sure every sermon I preach, like, it's pointing to the gospel of Christ. So the Old Testament points forward, New Testament points back. Somehow, with a faithful reading of the scripture, no matter what section I'm in, it's going to somehow lead to the life of Jesus. Here, it's very easy to do that because it's just like
super easy to do that here.
Yeah. I don't know. So I think I would focus a lot on the humility piece for the call to action at the end. And how it's important to be humble, like God is humble, and to be joyful, like God is joyful. and to be someone who serves like God serves. So like that's 3 points right there. Like
Right.
and the humility piece is so important because it's like again, quoting C.S. Lewis here on humility, he says, humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's just thinking of yourself less.
Yeah.
It's getting to this state of like not caring about how you are perceived by others, not thinking that you're too full of yourself, not thinking that you're a big deal or a big shot, but just not even focusing on those mind games that we could play when we compare ourselves to other people or thinking that we need to puff ourselves up. Like just
Yeah.
getting over that nonsense that so many of us fall victim to. And so I could just be content right now and serve other people. Uh, I would stress that, and then I would probably preach about how the gospel frees us to get to that point.
Right.
And Jesus being not only the example, but finding our acceptance, finding all the things that we're trying to long for. We find joy in what Jesus did for us, and our natural response should be worship, joy, and thanks.
Right. I like that. I mean, the one thing that really strikes me as central is this concept, like you said, of humility. And so in English it's a little hidden. In that line in verse 6, he says, even though he was in the form of God, didn't consider equality with God something to, it says, exploit. But in Greek, I think it's literally like grasp, something to be like seized and taken for oneself. So he did the opposite of what Adam and Eve do in the garden, right? So Adam and Eve see what's good in their own eyes, they take it for themselves, and that introduces death into creation. And Jesus does the opposite, right? And if anybody does a deep dive into some of our old episodes, one of the first episodes we talked about recapitulation and Irenaeus and his whole idea of Jesus living out Adam's life, but in the right way and like correcting humanity in that way. So what Jesus does is the opposite. Instead of taking for himself, he allows God to define what's good. He himself takes on death, and a new way opens up as he lives out that obedience. So to think about the church as the undoing of a broken way of humanity, I think is a really interesting way to take the text. Like what the church should be trying to do is undo the broken vices that introduce death and destruction into humanity. And our communities should be communities of mutual service, mutual love, where we're characterizing the kind of love that Jesus characterized here on earth.
Yeah, but to I've heard sermons on this where instead of focusing on the love and the humility piece, they focus on the judgment piece. Because Christ is coming back, every knee will bow one day, every tongue confess that he is Lord. That means there will be one interpretation is there'll be a time when Jesus returns where everyone is going to be placed in this position of just worship and surrender to him. So I've heard a couple of sermons where the pastor would be like, all right, now is your moment to surrender to him versus the second coming. So it's like it's like a fire and brimstone-esque versus the humility lovey-dovey approach.
Like do it now or else yeah. There's a so there's a corollary to that in Revelation. There's the image of the throne room where John hears the Lion of the tribe of Judah, and then when he turns around, he sees a lamb that's slaughtered. And so there's a way of interpreting that where, like, Jesus came as a lamb, but he's coming back like a lion or something like that, or but I think the best way to take it is that the lion is actually the lamb. So like when the judgment of God will be surprising in the way that it's executed. So yeah, I don't know how I would take it. When you get to the end there and you say every knee shall bow and every tongue confess, you could take that as judgment language, like he's coming and the whole place, you better get ready to bow your knee, which is a legitimate way to interpret the text. And it could be seen as a text of relief,
Yeah.
like the creation groaning for somebody to come and make it right. And then every knee will finally be able to bow and say, thank God. The self-giving, self-sacrificing God of love is going to make things right. I think you could take it with the negative or the positive. I don't know. Maybe it's the same side of the, or the different side of the same coin. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe. God knows. So there's definitely like there's also this elevation of Christ, this ascension piece and this return piece in this song. So it's like a full on gospel account. And I think it's important to know that like the person who judges and is in charge is Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, okay, step back, let him be the judge. And I think it's always dangerous to kind of fall into that position of judge, going back to like what Adam does, wanting to know and decide what's good and evil, versus Christ being that Adam for us who knows what's right and wrong. His judgments are the ones that matter.
I also just always go back to the Gospels and think like when we say Jesus is judge, like that same guy that we have presentations of in the Gospel is the one who's going to be doing the judging. So the criteria of Jesus is Jesus is most upset with the people who have power and do nothing with it, or with the people who have power and who like misappropriate it and marginalize people and hurt others with it. Like he's most upset with those people. So it's almost like we start to create Jesus in our own image when we start to judge people according to the things we want to judge people by, if that makes sense.
Are you saying that Jesus is going to judge us based on how judgmental we are?
It's a very meta definition of justice. Yeah, it's very interesting.
But
there's also that piece right after this of work out your salvation with fear and trembling.
Yeah, right after this. So I think a good way to see Jesus versus being this like hippy dippy love bug guy who just wants to hug everyone and this like wrathful king is like just having awe, because there could be this sense of awe. There should be a sense of awe when it comes to God. Like I feel like awe is the right word. Is this fear and trembling, knowing that God is completely other, completely holy, completely perfect, and I'm all messed up. Like naturally, like I'm gonna react in a awe-filled way towards Christ or towards God. I think that's the natural response people should have whenever they have like an encounter with God here on earth or in the next life. Like it should be this holy reverence where you just like overwhelmed with the power, the joy, the beauty, the holiness of God, where you are like amazed.
Yeah,
you have to keep this healthy tension.
Yeah, it has to be. I mean, there needs to be an element of otherwise you're just describing yourself,
right?
Like in loud language. What was it? I think Karl Barth used to have this frustration with natural theology. He said it's just human beings speaking really loudly about themselves, like, and that's kind of what you want to run away from. You don't want to be just risking like idealistic language of human beings. And I kind of take that concept of working out your faith in fear and trembling, in connection with language from the Old Testament where God's presence shows up in the temple or at Mount Sinai. Like whenever God's presence arrives, there is this sense of, awe, like you said. I mean, whether it's fear, whether it's just inspiration, whether it's joy, there's just a sense of this is weighty, this is big. Which by no coincidence, the word for glory in Hebrew is the word for heaviness and weight. So I think there's something there that whatever we're doing in the church is is the space where God is at work. So do it with a sense of weightiness and heaviness, and with a recognition that this community that we're a part of called church is a place where God is at work.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the main themes of Philippians that gets overlooked is there is this clear sense of purpose because of Christ now for Paul, and it's that weight of living out that purpose, finding is like really the thing that gives you your life meaning and joy and peace, and it drives him. So Paul's called to be an evangelist. He was called to plant churches, and he's in a Roman prison jail. So he's rejoicing because he's still carrying out that purpose. He's converting the Roman guards, and he's saying that, look, I've had success.
Right.
I'm still living out this purpose, even though it doesn't make sense that I can't live it fully.
Right.
And to do it in a manner without grumbling, he says later, without whining, but just to be living this out with the joyful attitude versus that judgmental condemnation attitude is really important for every Christian to take on. Like there needs to be joy, but it's not like naive optimism. Like Paul gets real and he talks about how, like, look, I've been through the ringer and brack. I've been beaten. I've been like, I'm not a good looking person because of all the beatings I've taken. I've endured hardship for all this. It's not easy, but I got joy.
Right. And I think part of the joy is that he's not doing this alone.
Right.
And I think that's something the letter also puts its finger on, that all throughout there is a sense that there's a community of support for Paul, and Paul is a support for the community. And throughout the letter, there's different sort of people. I mean, there's different people who are held up as people to imitate. So he talks about imitating Christ here. Then he talks about imitating, I think, Timothy at one point. He talks about imitating Epaphroditus, the guy who probably delivered the letter to the church.
Yeah.
So this idea of, you know, you don't do this thing in isolation from other people. You do it together. And that's the other word that pops up all throughout Philippians is the word koinonia, which is fellowship, which means a sort of partnership that exists. And the gospel is something that only works when we're in partnership with one another. Let me rephrase that. The gospel works itself out when we're in partnership with one another. That's how it works.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And that's like in the hymn, it's implied that Christ has this relationship with the Father.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the Trinity is an outpouring of this fellowship.
Right. Right.
Which is so important, where there's this joy, this humility, this completely giving to the other, which is so central to who God is. And there's this divine, holy personhood in the Trinity of this divine joy that's there because it's the Father is always on focusing on the Son. The Spirit's also, it's like this never-ending dance of this circle that's eternal and completely other. And I love how, like, there's this phrase in the New Testament, like, I'm telling you this so my joy can be completed.
That's right.
You can't just be joyful by yourself. I think that's the difference between the pursuit of happiness.
Right. And he says that just before this, actually, right? He says, you know, if there's any of this, any of that, make my joy complete by having the same mind as one another, but then later the mind of Christ. So that's all there. So let's wrap it up. What do you think you would title the sermon if you were going to title this something? I think if I were playing on the image of imitating Christ's self-giving love in the community, I think I want to go with something like "You are who you worship," or something like that, or "Becoming who you worship," or something like that. I don't know. That's where I'm going.
Yeah, maybe
I think
humbled by awe, or something clever. I tend to do more clever sermons that like only I get, which is never good. I also feel like sermon titles are not as important as they used to be.
Yeah, they're not. I feel like sometimes I put them in and I'm like, did anybody even catch this?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I think it'd be like,
But for me, I feel like it helps me narrow in on what I want to communicate. Like if I have a title, I'm like, okay, I want to reinforce this title so people know what I mean when I say the title.
yeah. I would probably, okay, I would call it singing the Christ hymn.
Cool.
So there's this participation, fellowship language together, and joining God in his song, and the play on words of the song. Yeah, I got it. Singing of the Christ hymn. It
Cool.
sounds mundane, but then you like, woo, unpack
there
that.
You go. Well, anybody out there who has a creative mind, throw in some possible titles we could use here as well.
Should we?
We need every little bit of help we can get.
Should we title this podcast episode "Singing the Christ"?
Singing the Christ. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, everyone. Thanks for watching this coffee hour on Facebook and YouTube or Spotify, wherever you're listening. We thank you that you're joining us. Again, comments below. If you like this kind of behind the scenes sermon prep conversation, please let us know. We'll do more of it. If not, that's fine too. We're still going to be doing it regardless of whether we record it. So it's all good. All right, everyone, stay caffeinating. God bless and have a wonderful week.